Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is it, it seems taller than me. So I'm almost delighted to be here. I'm very happy to be able to introduce this session this afternoon titled Crossings in the Early Modern Ottoman and Iberian Worlds. It's a real pleasure to have been able to read the work of these people with which I was familiar before. So the first paper is by Hussein Fancy, and he is currently a fellow, one of the postdocs at Ann Arbor, at the University of Michigan. His fields of study are medieval Europe and North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Crusades, a number of other areas. He received his PhD in history from Princeton University and a BA in English literature from Yale University. He's currently working on two related projects based primarily on Latin, Arabic, and Romance archival sources from Spain. The first is titled Mercenary Logic, and that attempts to rethink interconfessional interaction in medieval Iberia by mapping the alliances of Muslim holy warriors and bandits with Catalan kings during the late 13th and early 14th century. The second is tentatively titled The Criminal Mediterranean, which uses movements of smugglers, corsairs, pirates, and mercenaries to imagine the Mediterranean not as a multi-confessional utopia between Europe and North Africa, but rather as a zone of competing laws and legitimacies that shaped as well as maintained religious and political boundaries from the 12th to 14th centuries. He has a couple of publications that are coming out. One is titled Smuggling Lives and Forging Captives in the Medieval Mediterranean. I'm just afraid I'm going to mess up the the titles. And another one, The Last Almohad, Abd al-Wahid Abidabus in the Kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon. So, thank you.
So I debated, I think, and flipped a coin and decided to improvise rather than read my talk. I have it written out, but Neil gave me courage. I've never done this before, so let's see how it goes. I also wanted to be polemical, because that was one of the urgings, to say things that we otherwise wouldn't say in polite company. So this might be a frighteningly strange and mean-sounding talk. This project began as a digression from my book. It was a problem, a conceptual problem, or an image, and I think that works well, although I have no images because I'm a medievalist and there's very little in that regard. And what really struck me is, or I hope to explain to you, is what is the problem, or where is the problem might be a better way of putting it. And there's a polemical intent behind this. Ultimately, what I want to say, or where I want to get to in this brief talk, improvised talk, is why it is that historicism and anthropology, with an emphasis on terms like hybridity, agency, culture, or even cultural relativism, fail to describe interconfessional or religious encounters. Why it is that religion is the term that continues to be so problematic. I want to begin with a startling image. This is from 1287 of a Christian mercenary captain in North Africa dressing his Muslim soldiers in crosses and leading them into battle against other Muslims. It's a very difficult image to imagine. It's also a deeply problematic one for a number of reasons, but I think that's the thing I want us to focus on. What does it mean for Muslims to put on crosses in 1287 and march into battle against other Muslims? How do we imagine that? Now, the sources themselves, or at least I've pulled this source from a 16th century manuscript by Pedro Berantes Maldonado called La Casa de Niebla, is itself the first problem, the source. It was written some 2.5 centuries after this event. The character it describes, Alfonso, what was his name? Pedro, no, I've forgotten his name. That's embarrassing. Don Alfonso Pérez de Guzmán, also called Guzmán el Bueno, is also a problem in the sense that he has become a figure of great literary embellishment. Several poems have been written about him, which include such episodes as his fight against a many-headed serpent around the suburbs of Fez. He took his lance and cast it into the mouth of the serpent and slew it. And this is the statue of him in Tarifa in Spain, which sort of commemorates that moment. He's got the lance in his hand as he's about to throw it. Not loud enough?
You can advance it one.
Ah. Here he is in Tarifa, staring across to North Africa confidently. The last problem with this text, this 16th century manuscript, is its patronage. It was commissioned by, I should look this up as well, the sixth Duke of Medina Sidonia, also called Don Alfonso de Guzman. He was the descendant of Guzman el Bueno. He was also the commander of the Spanish Armada. So we have a number of reasons to reject this story. After all, could he have been urging Barrantes Maldonado, the author, to whitewash this episode, to turn Guzman el Bueno, who was a mercenary in North Africa, into an evangelist, in essence? There's another problem, which is the political history from which this emerges. 1287. 1287 was also the period of a Marinid assault into Spain. Abu Yusuf, the Marinid Sultan, had led 4 major offensives into Spain. And it was, in fact, during, this period that he was at open war with both Castile and the Crown of Aragon. The anonymous Dakhira al-Saniya, which records these attacks, describes them rather beautifully. They crossed morning and evening to assault the enemy, as if the ocean were a pavement for their steeds, with the seaweed bearing the charges up, as if the 2 shores were joined together, and all had become a single causeway to tread. So in this context of the Marinid Sultan invading Spain, can we imagine that a Christian serving in his army was leading his soldiers into battle wearing crosses? It's difficult to imagine. Barrantes, for his part, tells us that it was, in fact, after the second of Abu Yusuf's assaults into Spain that he saw Guzman el Bueno in battle and decided to recruit him into his army. Alfonso X, the Castilian king, had sent Guzman el Bueno to negotiate a peace treaty with Abu Yusuf, and Abu Yusuf recruited Guzman el Bueno, and Guzman el Bueno agreed. Guzman sold his possessions, gathered 50 of his followers along with their families, and entered into the service of the Marinid Sultan in Morocco. Barrantes added, which I thought was interesting, "This was much as men in my own time go to the Indies to seek honor and fortune." Kissing the Sultan's hands, Guzman swore allegiance to Abu Yusuf, who made the Castilian knight captain of his royal guard, which is to say captain of his personal protectors, and indeed of all the Christian soldiers that he had in his service. But Barrantes added this little clause. Guzman had distinguished himself from all other Christian soldiers in Abu Yusuf's service by swearing to serve Abu Yusuf only against Muslims, but never against Christians. This agreement, nevertheless, seems to have served the Sultan's purpose. Abu Yusuf, Barrantes told us, charged this Castilian knight and his troops with pacifying and collecting tribute from nomadic tribes called Arabs in the text, who had rebelled during the Sultan's absence during his jihad into Spain, or his multiple incursions into Spain. At Guzman's request, moreover, the Sultan freed all the Christians held captive in North Africa, or at least those held in the coastal cities, such that they could serve in his army, and he put together a group of 1,600 knights and footmen. And thus, Barrantes adds the detail of religious transvestism that concerns us here. Alfonso Perez ordered, quote, I'm quoting, sorry. Alfonso Perez ordered that all the knights, Alfonso Perez ordered all the Christians to put the sign of the white and colored cross on their chests and back so that they would be distinguished from the Moors. And he told the king, Abu Yusuf, that is, to order the Moors that would be going with him to place the same sign as the Christians, so that in battle they would not be confused with the rebels or killed indiscriminately. The king ordered it so But among the Moors, some did this, while others took offense to wearing the sign of the Christians. Thus, we arrive at the image of Muslim crusaders in the literal sense of the crusader, someone who wears the cross, the crucis ignati, with which I began this talk. Now, it bears standing back a little bit to look at this moment. I've started with this really focused image of Muslims putting on crosses and asked you, is it possible? And I think it requires us to step back and just imagine how this episode could or could not have been possible. I pulled this episode, in fact, from a 1904 article by a man by the name of José Alemany. I'll return to him again. But indeed, a lot has been written about Christian soldiers serving in North Africa. Their history is quite long. It goes back to the 10th century. And in fact, during the period of the Almohads and the Almoravids, I don't know how many of you know this, but particularly fanatical period in North Africa, as well as the rise of crusading ideology in Spain, these kinds of interactions continued unabated. Christians regularly crossed into North African lands. And it's in this period that we get figures like El Cid, Sancho the Fat, etc. The 13th century, which is the moment in which Guzmán el Bueno crosses over into North Africa, is itself a particularly interesting period. The Almohads have declined, and they've been replaced by several small states in North Africa, the Marinids among them, who we're interested in, but there were several others. In Spain itself, there were particularly new ideas derived from Roman law, a new philosophy of nominalism, new claims to sovereignty, that sort of grounded this period, made the 13th century particularly interesting. It's also a particularly conservative period when it came to religious boundaries. Which makes us ask, again, how is it possible in a period of crusade and jihad, in a period of hardening religious attitudes, where Christendom or Christian identities are becoming firmer than they ever have, where sovereign states are making particular claims that they never did in the past, that someone is crossing a boundary like this, moving to North Africa, and then convincing a Muslim sultan to dress his soldiers like Christians. In the past, Alemany in 1904, and then more recently someone like Simon Barton, writing 100 years later in 2005, have offered us two very different ways of looking at these soldiers. On the one hand, Alemany tells us, or urges us to imagine this episode this way. Since Guzmán el Bueno was crossing political and religious lines, he tells us, he must have been a mercenary. There can be no other explanation for his actions. Stripped of his religious and political allegiances, he must have been motivated by those base human motivations, greed and honor. Which is to say, in a certain sense, that his actions are exceptional. Simon Barton, writing almost 100 years later, has a very different reading of this same episode. He tells us that the episode of Guzmán el Bueno and the crossing of Christian knights into North Africa is nothing exceptional, but in fact the norm. This is how all interaction was. Religion was never significant when it came to interaction, but rather Guzmán el Bueno reflects the cultural norms of his day, of elite, aristocratic military knights. They were driven by their own particular cultural concerns, which is to say, greed and honor, rather than religious ideology. We could see these two pieces, and I've only chosen two, but there's several others, 1904 versus 2005, as reflecting, I'd say, a century of debates about tolerance and intolerance in the Western Mediterranean. On the one hand, Alemany telling us that the Western Mediterranean is essentially intolerant, and occasionally interactions intervene, or occasionally there are interactions between Muslims and Christians that can be conceived of as tolerant, and Barton telling us that tolerance is rather the norm, and intolerance is the exception. But I think what's more intriguing is to imagine these two approaches, Alemany and Barton, as reflecting the turn from empiricism to hermeneutics, or what I mean by this are philosophical claims about the essential nature of man to more culturally driven analyses of interconfessional interaction. So, for instance, Alemany, sounding a bit like Hegel's Cunning of Reason, or Adam Smith, urges us to imagine that the exceptional interaction of these soldiers, driven by their private interests, served the greater good of the Western Mediterranean. Religious fanaticism was held at bay by men operating according to their basic interests, their basic greed. On the other hand, and I think importantly, Barton tells us that such essentializing claims about the nature of man are problematic, and he would rather see this approach of the Western Mediterranean through a cultural lens. He sees Guzman and Bueno as reflecting a military aristocratic culture. And in this case, Guzman and Bueno makes his decisions based on his culture, based on his imagining of what is right for him in this particular moment. Thus, he moves away from any claims about structures or the essence of man towards a culturally situated reading. What troubles me with all of this, though, is rather than the difference between these two approaches, they're remarkably different, is the inner solidarity between them. In fact, we could say that what unites empiricist approach and a later hermeneutically driven approach is the belief that religion had nothing to do with the movement of Guzman and Bueno to North Africa, or nothing to do with an episode like Muslims putting on crosses, right? In fact, both share a kind of economic rationalism, a view of these soldiers as mercenaries, which I find limiting. Pedro Barantes, our author, doesn't quite see it this way. He describes Guzman and Bueno's motivations as follows, or at least part of them. He places these words in Guzman and Bueno's mouth. It is good that we apply ourselves in this battle. This is as he's urging his soldiers into battle. It is good that we apply ourselves in this battle, because in doing so, we are killing our enemies. We are killing the enemies of God, that is the Muslims, and the enemies of the king, Abu Yusuf. If this statement appears to us as incoherent, contradictory, or disingenuous, then perhaps we should not allow it to foreclose any readings. We should not dismiss it out of hand, is what I'm urging. The conceptual failure, I would argue, is the term religion. Historicism altogether is opposed to religion. Religion itself, I would say, emerges as a term with historicism. Let me take a different approach to this problem. Well, alongside historicism, I would say there's a second problem here that needs to be unearthed, or a second problem I have with this particular approach to this, which is it lacks a comparative approach, right? Nowhere here is anyone using Arabic sources to talk about Christian soldiers in North Africa. It's in this sense that I think some important revisions can be made, or we can move away from the term religion as a useful term for describing this interaction. Let me give one example from my own research. In the Crown of Aragon archives, where I do most of my research, there's 200 extraordinary Arabic charters called the Cartas Árabes. They're some of the most important Arabic archival sources in the world, and virtually untapped. And in these sources, we see something extraordinary, which is that Christian soldiers, these Christian soldiers who moved to North Africa, were literally traded for Muslim soldiers. Just as Christian soldiers moved into the armies of North African sultans, Muslim sultans, they were agreeing to trade back Muslim soldiers to serve in Christian armies. And in these same treaties, we see reciprocal agreements. You use your Muslim soldiers to fight Christians, we'll use our Muslim soldiers to fight. I'm sorry, did I say that right? You use our Christian soldiers to fight Muslims, we'll use your Muslim soldiers to fight, I've said that completely wrong, but you get the gist. You get the gist. Here's the improvisational problem. I'm not good at it. The literal gesture of crusade is traded for jihad. And this is what, for me, becomes the most intriguing part of this story. That if we reduce the sort of theological component or the religious component to merely a hermeneutics of, or let's say a cultural reading, we've lost this dimension altogether. Violence in one tradition is traded for another. And if we were to just be politically skeptical and see this as merely strategic, I feel as though we're missing an element, or at least that's the nature of my polemic. So let me put it this way, and let me give you some other examples that I think are useful for thinking through this. In the case of Muslim soldiers traveling to the Crown of Aragon, they do two things. One, they literally constitute the space of the sovereign. They move into the crown of Aragon and they become the personal protectors of the Aragonese kings, which I think is a troubling thing to imagine. How would it have been perceived, or what did it mean in a period of perhaps the first sovereign yearnings, right? Roman law has emerged on the scene, and these Catalan or these Aragonese kings are making vast, vast claims about their jurisdictional authority, yet they are expressing it through Muslim soldiers whose singular purpose is to kill Christians in their own minds, by their own contracts, right? They will not use them for any other purpose. And in fact, these soldiers are used to kill their own Christian subjects. So that's one. Two is that these soldiers are exempted from all laws. They exist within the Crown of Aragon in a kind of exceptional sense. They don't need to follow sumptuary laws. They cannot murder. They don't need to pay taxes. But they can also be killed with impunity, which is another fascinating problem with them. So they exist in a kind of strange, exceptional category that's irreducible, I think, or cannot be reduced to simply strategic maneuvering. The same is true with Christian soldiers. They move to North Africa. They serve in the presence of the sultans as his sort of constituting the space of his sovereignty. This is a deeply problematic issue. There are several sources in which Sufi saints or others come forward to curse and spit at these barbarians, as they're called. He uses them to suppress his own populations, to gather taxes. He allows them to build churches, drink wine. He prevents Christian soldiers from converting to Islam. Again, their presence is exceptional, or their legal status is exceptional. And this fascinates me. What I would like to link this to is, in fact, the claims of authority that Christian and Muslim sovereigns are simultaneously making, which is to say that their own status, their own legal statuses are exceptional. They do not belong. They stand above. They constitute. They get to define what is Christian or what is not, what is Muslim or what is not. And this is one of the competing claims of 13th century rulers, competing certainly against the papacy, which I think is articulated through the presence of these soldiers. So what am I saying in sum? One, I'm saying that the hermeneutic insistence, or the sort of hermeneutic historical insistence of religion as a category, forces us to see religion in one of two ways, either as an externality, which is to say as political ideology, thinly veiled political ideology, or as an internality, which is abstract and universal, neither of which is adequate for describing a situation like this, neither of which is adequate for describing how it is possible that a Muslim sultan could sponsor crusade, or a Christian king could sponsor jihad, and have those be meaningful gestures. Rather, what we see in moments like this, or what the Muslim crusader makes possible for us to imagine, or what he reflects, I think, is rather what Ernst Kantorowicz or Carl Schmitt has told us is a political theology that existed in the 13th century. A sense in which political categories and theological categories blurred with one another, cannot be easily distinguished. In the same sense, we can say peace and violence were not separate categories. Pacific interaction and violent interaction were not opposite categories. Here, again, the inner solidarity between these two views, between Alamani's empiricist, philosophical approach to these mercenaries and Simon Barton's culturalist, anthropologically driven one, the shared view is that any religious interaction has nothing to do with religion. I found that such a deeply troubling conclusion to come to. Anytime Muslims and Christians interact, it happens on a space or a ground that has nothing to do with religion. But if we shift the terms, if we imagine what is that other term? So what is that other term? That's really the question. The one I would like to propose, or the one that I would think that we should try to return to, is an interest in ontology again, or an interest in theology. These are deeply problematic, I know. And in a sense, the focus on the cross, right, brings us back to something else, which is what I would call a materialist ontology, right? One that is not wholly ungrounded. We're still looking for the literal connections. There is still a thing out there to which we're referring, but its power, its agency is different than one we would otherwise imagine through a culturalist lens. It is one that belongs in the realm of ontology, or theology, rather. And that, I think, is one new place, or one imagined space to head towards encounter. Thanks.
All right. So our next speaker is Natalie Rothman, who I had the pleasure to meet many years ago at a Folger seminar with Patricia Fortini Brown. And it's been terrific to have opportunities in the last few years for our paths to cross. It's like I've been reading too much about crossing boundaries and mixtures this afternoon. So Natalie is an assistant professor of history. She's at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and she was a student at the University of Michigan, where she completed her PhD. She is someone who is really a specialist on Venetian-Ottoman relations and looks at that in a number of different ways, in particular around issues of conversion, translation, and empire. She has a book that's going to be coming out soon, maybe in a year, with Cornell University Press. The book is titled Trans-Imperial Subjects, Boundary Markers of the Early Modern Mediterranean. This is something that I think will be a really important contribution to the field, as her dissertation has been already. I just wanted to say a couple of things about her publications, because I was struck reading some of the titles of her essays, how much the idea of movement is something that is kind of registered in the title. So Becoming Venetian, Conversion and Transformation in the 16th Century Mediterranean, Between Venice and Istanbul, Trans-Imperial Subjects and Cultural Mediation in the Early Modern Mediterranean. That's the title of her dissertation. Self-Fashioning in the Mediterranean Contact Zone. Another is Interpreting Dragomans, Boundaries and Crossings in the Early Modern Mediterranean. Another coming out this year, Genealogies of Mediation, Culture Broker, and Imperial Governmentality. And the most recent one, Trans-Imperial Subjects, Boundary Markers of the Early Modern Mediterranean. So welcome. Can I move this? Yes, please.
If you just go forward,
yeah.
it should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bronwen. Thanks, Neil, for the invitation to what has already been a terrific conference, and I'm looking forward to continued conversations tomorrow. I'm not going to be as brave as Hussein, and I'm just going to read my paper, so if you'll indulge me. Oops, this is the wrong presentation.
What's that?
Yep.
What?
It's the wrong set of slides. This is not.
Okay,
This
let's
is-
switch it.
Yeah, we should.
There's coffee in the back. Do you have your
You still have it, yeah. Since the mid-1980s, interest in the history of imperial encounters has been driven by historians, anthropologists, and colonial and post-colonial critics' reassessment of what was once euphemistically called European discovery. It is therefore ironic that much of the debate about early modern imperial encounters, while acknowledging its debt to Edward Said's pioneering Orientalism, has bypassed Orientalism's locus classicus, the Mediterranean, and focused instead on South and Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and most paradigmatically, the Atlantic. This geographical orientation has meant that, until recently, most studies of imperial encounters emphasized their brief and circumscribed nature, as in raids or exploratory voyages, and the contrasting and presumably mutually unintelligible epistemologies of the people these encounters brought into contact. And we certainly heard a very forceful critique of that earlier through Sanjay Subramaniam's talk. Such studies of imperial encounter were crucial for exploring the specificity of European epistemologies, denaturalizing what earlier generations of scholars often took to be universal rationalism. Yet, the formulation of sharp, pre-existing and absolute dichotomies between European and non-European knowledge-making practices came at a cost. By ignoring the sustained nature of most imperial engagements, this body of scholarship has lent credence to various paradigms of clash of civilizations. It has also obscured the role of intermediaries in calibrating and recalibrating the boundaries of the very units they claim to mediate, colonizers and colonized, or European and its other. In an effort to overcome these epistemological impasses, I wish today to shift focus to the Mediterranean and to look at the role of a specific cadre of professional intermediaries in the inter-imperial engagements of the early modern period. By so doing, I aim to explore how categories of belonging and difference were articulated by subjects who traversed imperial boundaries and who had privileged access to metropolitan institutions, genres of writing, and modes of circulation. I believe that by recovering the history of how such subjects transgressed and contested boundaries, we can begin to reconceptualize the connected histories of early modern Mediterranean societies, not as an abstract process of influence due to mere spatio-temporal contiguity, but as a web of processes of mediation, whereby specific imperial categories of difference were calibrated and recalibrated within specific genres and institutions. Given that circum-Mediterranean societies had been in contact with one another for millennia, we can here reconceptualize contact zone, not as, and I quote, spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, in Mary Louise Pratt's very famous words, but as sites where boundaries are drawn and redrawn, where alterity is produced and managed. As recent historiographies of the Ottoman Empire, among other historiographies, have demonstrated, the institutions of early modern Mediterranean commerce and diplomacy were especially important sites for conceiving of and managing ethno-linguistic alterity. In particular, the foreign embassies of early modern Istanbul played an essential role in articulating relations between Ottoman elites, long-term sojourners at the port, and an emerging European-wide republic of letters. Key nodes in this relationship were dragomans, or diplomatic interpreters, whose practices of translation and mediation served as precedents and prototypes for the nascent disciplines of philology and Orientalism. And I realize that I'm making a huge claim here, and I'd be happy to elaborate on why I think that they are really kind of at the forefront of this budding scholarship of philology later on. Yet, despite a burgeoning interest in early modern representations of Islam, to date, scholars have paid surprisingly little attention to the ways in which practices of representation emerged out of Europeans' intense interaction with the most powerful Islamic polity of the time, namely the Ottoman Empire, and its range of subjects, objects, institutions, and most importantly for my argument today, semiotic technologies and modes of circulation. In some sense, this neglect is not surprising, given Said's own glaring lack of interest in the Ottomans and the modernist bias of the post-colonial project as a whole. Yet the ongoing engagement between the Ottomans and their neighbors is crucial to address if we are to reach a less linear and teleological understanding of the genealogies of Orientalism. This paper, therefore, shows how the diplomatic and scholarly networks through which knowledge of the Ottomans formed and circulated crucially involved Ottoman elites themselves in intimate and ongoing conversations with long-term sojourners in the Ottoman Empire. It thus views the writings that emerged from the diplomatic milieu of early modern Istanbul as having participated in the project of constituting Europe, a project that was informed from early on by competing ideas about civilization and the relationship between language, religion, and political subjecthood. As is well known, the early modern period witnessed an intensifying awareness of and fascination with things Turkish. And we certainly heard about this earlier today as well. Ottoman practices of female dress, imperial governance, and military discipline informed English and French elite fashion, Italian political theory, Dutch military reform, Habsburg court music, and so on and so forth. At the same time, many other aspects of Ottoman social life were objectified as signs of alterity incommensurable with European quote-unquote practices. In the context of ongoing warfare, both the structural similarities between the Ottomans and their neighbors' political and religious institutions on the one hand, and the growing appetite for Ottoman exotica on the other, were fueled by a fledgling print culture in which the Ottomans were a favorite, though not always favored, topic. knowledge of Ottoman society and culture relied on the unprecedented textual and visual output of sojourners in the Ottoman capital, travelers, missionaries, merchants, and especially diplomats. These sojourners thus became the authorities on things Ottoman, and their extensive sojourns in the empire, shaped by the increasingly codified protocols of contemporary diplomacy, a requisite practice for producing legitimate knowledge. Such foreign visitors, in turn, relied crucially on a network of local and localized interlocutors and intermediaries for gaining familiarity with and developing their own perspective on Ottoman society. One vital cadre of such intermediaries was the corps of dragomans employed by foreign embassies at the port. Whether they were born and raised in the Ottoman capital or merely long-term sojourners, dragomans were not only ubiquitous in Istanbul's Christian suburbs, and especially in Galata, the site of most foreign embassies, but appeared as regular guests both at court and in Ottoman officials' homes. Unlike modern diplomatic interpreters who engage in simultaneous oral translation between two parties, these dragomans often acted independently as emissaries and negotiators, only later producing written and oral reports to their employers about their interactions with Ottoman government representatives. And this is equally true of Ottoman dragomans interacting with foreign powers. In other words, dragomans served as principal actors in the production and circulation of news in Istanbul, itself a central node of early modern diplomacy, as historians increasingly recognize. Dragomans' interpretive work was thus crucial in procuring for foreign diplomats and their numerous guests a current store of knowledge about Ottoman politics and society. Significantly, they did not simply make information available, but shaped many of the discourses about the Ottomans that were then inscribed in official diplomatic dispatches and reports. These reports themselves circulated widely, translated and anthologized into, quote, manuals of political theory, end quote, for European-wide consumption. I'm quoting here Lucette Valency. By the early 17th century, as dragoman positions became de facto heritable within a small circle of Istanbul-based Christian families, and as many young dragomans apprenticed and lived for decades in embassy compounds, the genres of diplomatic writing, as well as the structures and content of diplomatic chancery archives, became not only quite standardized, but essential to dragoman's own social reproduction.
Do we have to advance it? For some reason it doesn't work with PowerPoint.
Okay, so I actually need to get to the fourth slide, so two more. Yeah, so this is one representation of dragomans apprenticing in an embassy compound. Dragomans, then, were essential to the production and circulation of current knowledge about the Ottomans to European-wide publics. But who were these dragomans? Elsewhere, I have traced in some detail the emergence of a highly endogamous and powerful cadre of dragoman families out of Venice's colonial nobility in the Aegean and Adriatic, the Venetian citizen class, and the Latin or Roman Catholic community of Galata. I have emphasized how the program that trained and socialized dragomans in the house of the resident of the permanent Venetian representative to the port, the bailo, combined elements of Venetian endogamy with Ottoman practices of exogamous recruitment to large elite households, a prime example of inter-imperial synthesis. I have also tried to show how their textual and visual strategies for representing the Ottomans can be related to dragomans' intimate ties to bureaucratic elites and knowledge of imperial institutions in both Venice and Istanbul. Indeed, most crucial to the articulation of a dragoman perspective on the Ottoman world was their status as trans-imperial subjects who operated across the Venetian and Ottoman empires. I apply the term trans-imperial subjects to dragomans, along with converts and their patrons, commercial brokers, merchants, and diplomats, and we could certainly add to this list, in order to draw attention to the connected and dialectical aspects of their emergence. While here today I focus primarily on Venetian dragomans in Istanbul, I believe that the category of trans-imperial subjects can be equally applied to other groups and settings as well. So what exactly are trans-imperial subjects? By way of an explanation, let me address each of the concept's components in turn. The prefix trans refers to the ways in which subjects regularly mobilize their roots elsewhere to foreground specific knowledge, privileges, or commitments to further their current interests. Trans further denotes the dispersion of kin and patronage ties across imperial frontiers, characteristic of many socially mobile families in the early modern Mediterranean and elsewhere, as well as individuals' dual residence and/or extended sojourns in multiple locales. Imperial is meant here not as a trendy catch-all phrase to speak about a range of forms of early modern governmentality with some family resemblance to modern colonial empires. Rather, following recent work in this field, it points to the production and management of alterity as essential to early modern imperial regimes. Imperial also serves as a reminder of the claim made by several early modern sovereigns, not least of which the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman, to universal God-sanctioned rule. Imperial thus points to the significance of religious authority for legitimizing temporal power and for cementing lines of presumed political attachment and loyalty. In the context of ongoing rivalry between the Mediterranean's two claimants to universal empire, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, confessional affiliation became a key criterion of imperial classification, asserted with renewed vigor in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Thus, imperial subjecthood increasingly came to imply certain religious as well as political bonds, potentially at odds with one's actual juridical status. Finally, the term subject evokes the questions of subject position and subject making, which have been at the heart of myriad imperial projects. The concept of trans-imperial subjects thus underscores the need to understand the perspective of those caught in the web of competing imperial mechanisms, but who at the same time were essential to producing methods to calibrate, classify, and demarcate imperial alterities. In particular, it calls attention to how these subjects articulated where sociocultural boundaries lay, what were the prototypical centers of different categories, and what their own in-betweenness might have meant. So rather than taking them to be kind of naturally in between, this I think allows us to really think what exactly is in-betweenness, how is the very status of in-between produced in these processes. In other words, rather than take the categories that subjects purport to mediate as an analytical a priori, the concept of trans-imperial subjects allows us to explore how these subjects themselves elaborated and naturalized certain key categories, such as Christendom, Islam, the Turk, Franks, the Levant, etc., and their boundaries. And rather than anachronistically celebrate the early modern Mediterranean as a site of multiculturalism, as is currently in vogue, a focus on trans-imperial subjects enables us to consider how both consciousness of alterity and the technologies for regulating it played out in the context of inter-imperial rivalry, as well as tacit collaboration between Ottomans and Venetians. The concept of trans-imperial subjects also serves as a reminder of the inevitable but often forgotten degree of institutional overlap between the imperial domains these subjects straddled. For example, certain notions of membership and belonging that trans-imperial subjects helped shape in early modern Venice paralleled in important ways contemporary Ottoman understandings of the potential transformation of foreigner into subject through extended residence, local marriage, and religious conversion, just to give one example. So methodologically, this calls for closer attention to mechanisms of articulation and to the politics of comparison inherent in claims that trans-imperial subjects made about the commensurability or incommensurability of political systems and social practices. Which gets me finally to the object. And let me exemplify how dragomans fit into this framework by looking at the ways in which specific artifact articulated a distinctly trans-imperial perspective on Ottoman politics, history, and society. The artifact in question is the Codex Cicogna 1971, now in the Museo Civico Correr in Venice. And it features a series of Ottoman miniatures with an extensive Italian gloss. My research suggested it was assembled in the Venetian Bylaws House, so the house of the permanent Venetian representative in Istanbul, in the early 1660s, perhaps as early as 1660, through collaboration between a Venetian diplomat and his dragomans, Ottoman miniaturists, and European draftsmen. Specifically, I believe that it was authored by longtime Venetian secretary and de facto ambassador to Istanbul, Giovanni Battista Ballarino, who intended it as a handbook on Ottoman society for his hoped-for replacement and as a cautionary tale about the vital importance of dragomans for Venetian diplomacy at the port. The codex contains 59 folios, the recto of which of each, featuring a miniature in watercolors, frequently gilded, which was mounted on the page with an Italian gloss preceding and following it, and sometimes spilling over onto the verso. The miniatures can be divided roughly into three broad themes. First is sultans' portraits, then the second one is genre scenes, monuments, material culture, and third, scenes from the Venetian-Ottoman War of Crete. By borrowing its representational techniques from several specifically Ottoman as well as European-wide genres, and when I say European-wide, I mean to actually include the Ottomans in this Europe, the codex positions itself as a product of an inter-imperial zone. Some of these genres themselves were typical articulations of an inter-imperial zone by engaging in ongoing cross-fertilization that traversed political and linguistic borders, as humanist learning proliferated in the Ottoman court and as Ottoman manuscripts and personnel circulated outside the empire. Throughout, the narrative of the Cicogna Codex uses the first-person plural to refer to Venetian collective action, emphasizes Venetian-Ottoman relations, and presupposes readers' prior knowledge of the history of these relations. Through these means, the narrative marks its intended audience among the Venetian political elite and erases any gaps between the narrator's voice and such authorized readers. The Codex opens with a series of 16 miniatures, which iconically represent Ottoman sultans, more or less in chronological order, each accompanied by a narrative of their military accomplishments and relations with Venice. So this is just it's clearly only I cut out the miniatures, but on the page it appears similar to the slide I showed earlier with an extensive gloss preceding and following it. The narrative accompanying these miniatures is abbreviated enough to suggest it was intended as a mnemonic device for someone already familiar with its history, as indeed would have been any Venetian diplomat sent to Istanbul, rather than as a layperson's introduction to the subject, and I'll come back to this point shortly. The use of serial sultanic portraiture as a means of a political military chronology was common to several early modern genres, including Persian and Ottoman silsilname, or books of genealogy, shahnameh, books of sultans, Qiyafetnameh, books of physiognomy, and their immensely popular humanist equivalents, such as the Lives of the Sultans produced by the likes of Paolo Giovio, Francesco Sansovino, and here Pietro Bertelli. If humanist portraiture projects had strong connections to Ottoman conventions of sultanic representation, Ottoman artists themselves were well familiar with the works of Italians such as Gentile Bellini and Costanzo da Ferrara, who had created sultans' portraits during their sojourns at Mehmed II's court. Another genre of the early modern inter-imperial zone to which the Cicogna Codex bears close resemblance is the muraka, next. Literally, that which is put together from several pieces. This genre, which is eclectic by definition, was premised on the compilation and reintertextualization of disparate images and texts. The Cicogna Codex is similarly a potentially open-ended artifact in which stock images are combined with especially commissioned ones. The technique of mounting a gilded miniature on a page and adding a gloss to accompany it and give it a new context also closely resembles muraka and album amicorum production techniques. These suggest the two faces of early modern manuscript culture, the appropriation of far-flung objects, either as part of an imperial system of artistic patronage, collection, and circulation, or as a more personalized souvenir, a visual icon of one's own travels. This interplay between distance and proximity of the objects that are literally captured on the page is clearly at work in the Cicogna Codex as well. Other contemporary genres inform this manuscript, including Stammbuch and Album Amicorum, which are on this page. I could go on and on, military manuals, architectural drawings, and city views. But for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to say much about them. Rather, let me simply recapitulate that the Cicogna Codex deftly merges Ottoman and European-wide genres, both in the composition, technique, and style of specific miniatures, as well as in their overall organization and sequencing. The heavy thematic, structural, and stylistic reliance on multiple genres distinguishes this codex and defies its clear categorization in any singular tradition, let alone as clearly Ottoman or Venetian. Crucially, the Codex does not simply juxtapose different genres, but insists on the key interpretive role of its authors in making sense of the visual material presented to the reader. Whereas most early modern Ottoman costume albums compiled pictorial anthologies with only brief captions, this Codex conjoins Ottoman miniatures with an extensive accompanying Italian gloss. In fact, at times the miniatures seem to provide but a pretext for lengthy narratives rather than the other way around. By superimposing a narrative gloss on miniatures predicated on multiple genres, the Codex simultaneously proclaims the image's limited intelligibility on their own as a product of a foreign world and assumes the voice of their only authorized interpreter. The act of cultural mediation thus becomes metonymic of the very role of Venetian diplomats and dragomans at the port. Whereas the first part of the Codex chronicles key moments in Venetian-Ottoman relations through the medium of sultanic portraiture, its second part uses genre scenes to introduce contemporary Ottoman urban society. But it does so in a way that diverges dramatically from that of costume albums, the most popular genre representing Ottoman society in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Costume albums provided visual anthologies of various peoples, professions, or estates, using costumes as iconic signs of ethnic diversity and social typology. In contrast, the Codex Cicogna features no portraits of ethnic types, and in fact includes no individual portraits of ordinary Ottoman subjects at all. Although some of the costumes in its miniatures do stand for different kinds of persons, Muslims, Franks and Latins, court officials, street vendors, those donning them are always situated in genre scenes, as we see here, rather than as abstract figures on a neutral backdrop. They are not prototypes, but interactionally defined persons. Unlike costume albums, then, the Cicogna Codex engages surprisingly little in the objectification of social types through the elaboration of dress codes. What the Codex does do is celebrate repeatedly the role of Venetian dragomans in the unfolding of Venetian-Ottoman relations. Both the text and the images of this Codex assign a prominent place to dragomans and dragoman apprentices, who are mentioned by name in 4 of the 10 folios devoted to Venetian diplomacy, and are visually represented in 2 others in ways that subvert the official Venetian order of precedence. For example, in folio 43, a dragoman who's identified through his dress is depicted riding a horse accompanied by 2 Ottoman officials ahead of Secretary Ballarino, his assistants, and dragoman apprentices. The dragoman's visual alignment with and enclosure between Ottoman officials and his separation from the rest of the Venetian contingent behind suggests his in-between status as simultaneously Ottoman and Venetian. His spatial positioning may also represent his imagined or actual elevated status in the Bailow's house against the official order of precedence, which would have subordinated him to Ballarino. And indeed, if you read Ballarino's extensive dispatches from Istanbul, he was stranded in the Ottoman Empire for over a decade during the war. One gets the impression that he was really ruled by the dragomans rather than the other way around. So he's heavily reliant on their work every step of the way. Thanks. Even more significant is the role ascribed in both image and text to a specific dragoman apprentice in preventing his Venetian employers from exacerbating an already precarious situation during their interrogation by the Ottoman Grand Vizier in 1649. On folio 35, the apprentice visually figures as a person situated in between the Ottoman interrogators, who are standing to the right, and Venetian diplomats Soranzo and Ballarino, who are seated to the left. His in-betweenness is conveyed in terms of his location higher and more centrally than his employers, while his bright orange ermine-trimmed cloak and distinct fur-lined headgear single him out as neither a Muslim nor a Frank, but rather a Latin, a Catholic Ottoman subject. In other ways, too, the manuscript reflects dragoman's view of the Ottoman world, a perspective which is trans-imperial, namely external to its object, and yet at the same time claims intimate knowledge of it. First, the narrative repeatedly wavers between admiration and critique of the sultans by interspersing the chronicle of their accomplishments with anecdotes that underscore their cruelty. And I actually took out an image of anal impalement, which would have been very relevant to Neil's presentation earlier today, but that's one of the images of a dragoman being executed allegedly by the Ottomans, but as we know from archival documents, at the prompting of the Venetians, who suspected him of treason and spying for the Habsburgs.
It's not considered good taste in British Columbia.
Indeed, yeah. In addition to their dramatic effects, such images of cruelty and such anecdotes reinforce distance from their object, which are otherwise depicted in a rather admiring tone. Yet, parallel to its emphasis on Ottoman cruelty, the Cicogna Codex also makes noticeable and repeated gestures to Ottoman-Venetian parity, not only military, and this is significant, but political, economic, and artistic as well. While the text points out some cultural differences, as in the form of musical instruments used to accompany the Sultana to the Sultan's chambers, other differences are subjected to acts of cultural mediation so that they seem less insurmountable. And for one example, the caravanserai is said to be used, quote, in the same mode that in Christendom taverns are used, end quote. And by the way, this is an interesting example of the erasure of ongoing interaction, because of course taverns in Mediterranean Europe are an appropriation and adaptation of funduks that are first Byzantine but also Arab institutions throughout the Middle Ages. So we have an interesting case of how this earlier moment of interaction is kind of suppressed in this process of commiseration. By the mid-17th century, Venetian open praise of Ottoman material culture was by no means standard, especially in light of Ottoman military might and its ongoing threat to the integrity of the Venetian Empire. The manuscript's visual and textual gestures toward the comparability, commensurability, and mutual influence of Ottoman and Venetian urban material culture is an important indication of the intimate understanding of things Ottoman from a Venetian perspective that the authors sought to present. But for me, that's precisely what makes them trans-imperial. As I mentioned, the manuscript's sense of intimacy with the Ottoman world is also achieved in part through its particular juxtaposition and merging of several visual and textual genres. The skilled manipulation of these genres throughout the manuscript reinforces the sense that a successful diplomat must be able to assume a very particular perspective, integrating knowledge that emerges from cultural centers that are distinct but not a priori unrelated. And this is my last slide. It is exactly in the act of mediation by those in between, both overtly and tacitly, that it is possible to see the multiple ways in which Venetian and Ottoman cultural centers were related and how the boundaries between an Ottoman and a Venetian text were thus established. The dragoman's perspective places the intermediary at the center of the text and by so doing subordinates Ottoman narratives to Venetian ones. Here then, again, we see the production of a Venetian and at the same time trans-imperial perspective on the Ottoman world. Thank you.
All right, the last paper is by Giancarlo Casale, and I've been trading places in the last few weeks. I just saw him at the University of Minnesota, where he teaches history. His PhD is from Harvard University, and he is a specialist in the Ottoman expansion in the Indian Ocean. This is something that he has, as well as the early modern Ottoman Empire. But I think one of the things that, at least for me, is particularly interesting is that expanding or thinking about the relationship to the Ottoman world also in the context of the Indian Ocean. He has a book which is his first book, which is on the Ottoman expansion of the Indian Ocean during the 16th century, and that explores the ways in which the growth of the Ottoman Empire during this period was part of the same historical process that witnessed the contemporaneous expansion of numerous other imperial powers, ranging from the overseas empires of Spain and Portugal to rival Islamic states like Mughal India and Safavid Iran. His next project is titled, for now, Curiosity and Intolerance, the Paradox of Early Modernity. This is a comparative study of the development of ethnographic modes of writing in early modern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. He's also had an interest in Ottoman naval technology. So just to cite a few of his publications, one is Global Politics in the 1580s, One Canal, 20,000 Cannibals, and an Ottoman Plot to Rule the World, if there was ever a great subtitle, I think that's it, from the Journal of World History. Another, the ethnic composition of Ottoman ship crews and the Rumi challenge to Portuguese identity in medieval encounters. Seascapes, maritime histories, global cultures, and transoceanic exchanges. Another one takes up the spice trade. Another on, with the title, His Majesty's Servant Lufti, the career of a previously unknown 16th century Ottoman envoy to Sumatra, based on an account of his travels from ... And then, just to mention one last one, an Ottoman and... Okay, all right.
My book actually just came out last week, and I know it's late, and I was going to propose that if you all promise to buy it, we can just go right now, because it's 2 hours later for me, and I could use a drink, to be honest. In lieu of that, I will try to be as brief and energetic as I possibly can. My topic today, can I just move on to the next slide?
You can actually, you can make that now, just to work for the other. Yep.
I'm going to go more. Yeah. Okay. So my topic today is, my object is this map here. It is known as the Map of Tunis Haji Ahmet, and it is a map that has attracted considerable attention over the past few years. To give you an idea, I think since 2005, it has been a part of major museum exhibits at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, another sister exhibit at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, a completely separate exhibit at the Freer and Sackler Galleries in Washington, D.C., and another one at the Oriental Institute in Chicago. So that's quite a lot of exposure. It also has been the subject of numerous academic studies and even of a brief web video entitled The Mystery of Haji Ahmet that you can all watch and enjoy on your iPod. So that's a lot of attention for one map that was created in an anonymous Venetian workshop some 450 years ago, 1559 to be specific. But it's not difficult to see why it has attracted so much attention, because it is a map of firsts. First, I know this is not such a good image. The world is here, but what I really want to draw your attention to is the text, the companion text, quite extensive. It goes all the way around. That is in Ottoman Turkish. This is quite interesting because except for two very famous world maps by the Ottoman cartographer Peter Rais, which exist only in fragmentary form, this is the very earliest Turcophone world map that we know of. It is also a woodcut. You can actually see there are 6 panels of apple wood here. And so this is a print. It was designed to be printed and mass-produced, and as such, it is one of the first examples, one of the first attempts to adopt Western printing technology to the special requirements of the Ottoman script. And as far as I know, it is the earliest work in the Turkish language of any kind to be printed. So that's all very interesting. It's also a hybrid work. Of course, it has this extensive Turkish text, but the image itself is something called an Orontius projection, so known because it was developed originally by somebody named Oronce Finet. He was, I think, professor of mathematics at the Collège de France, Collège Royal, in the 1530s. So this is the map with all of the text taken out. And then this here would be the original map by Oronce Finet. It's quite obvious that it's the same projection. And then best of all is the ostensible attribution of the map, which we learn from a rather extensive autobiographical sketch, which is up here. It is supposed to be the work of its eponymous author, Tunislu Haji Ahmet, who tells us that he was a native of Tunis, trained in the madrasas of Morocco, who then had the misfortune of being captured by pirates, sold into slavery, purchased by a Venetian nobleman who fortunately recognized his erudition and then offered him his freedom in exchange for help making this map. So with all this different wonderful hybridity, the technological elements, and then the fact that we've got this great authorship, seemingly taken straight out of the pages of Orhan Pamuk's The White Castle. All this has really helped to solidify Haji Ahmed's reputation, and I think it's fair to say that this map has really become kind of an icon of this new historiography of the cosmopolitan early modern world that I think Natalie also was referring to a little bit. Now, before you get too excited, I can see all the excitement. It's a little late in the day for excitement, but to the extent it's possible, I should tell you that this is not necessarily excitement that has been shared by Ottomanists. And this is because 50 years ago, the formidable Ottoman philologist Victor El Minhaj wrote an article in which he essentially exposed Haji Ahmed as an imposter and his text as a forgery. I won't get into the details of the argument, but he basically did a very careful reading of the text. He identified several systematic, grammatical, orthographic, and in some cases just factual errors that he argued somebody who was really a native speaker of either Turkish or Arabic and trained in a madrasa would never have made. He said, in fact, that they were the kind of errors that you would expect somebody who was an Italian speaker who had learned Turkish as a second language might have made. And he went on to offer some suggestions about who that person might be. Now, for the sake of time, this could be the subject of a whole different talk, but for the sake of time, I don't want to get too deeply into this debate about the real identity of Haji Ahmed. For our purposes, all I really need you to know is that all of the excitement about this map, the museum exhibits, the articles, the numerous catalog entries, they have all been written by people who can't actually read it. And that's because anybody who can actually read it doesn't think it's interesting because Minhaj told them that it was a fake. All right? Now, what I thought I would do is read it and see what it says. That was my humble contribution. And when I did do so, I was completely taken by surprise because it's a fascinating, fascinating text. And the more I read into it and thought about it, the more I realized that what it really amounted to is a systematic definition of what it means to be European. Now, this is really something because it's only in the 16th century that intellectuals in the West actually begin to take seriously this idea of Europe as a place with a historical and a cultural consciousness and identity as distinct from Christendom. And there are a few texts that are older than this one that you could point to that are taking on this problem, but not very many. And so I think the mere fact that one of the very earliest systematic articulations of European identity is actually being written in Ottoman Turkish is quite extraordinary. So let me just introduce you to a couple of elements of the text to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I should start by saying that it has a lot of different elements to it, but the main body of the text is a systematic overview of the world, which follows an astrological schema. So it identifies the 4 continents. This would be Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World. And then the 7 most important rulers and the 12 most important kingdoms. And the 7 most important rulers are each associated with a planetary body. The 12 kingdoms are each associated with the sign of the zodiac. And this also has a rhetorical significance that I will come back to. Okay, so let me start by just reading you his description of Europe. All right? He says, Europe. This is the part of the world that they also call Fringistan. This continent is special in that it is small compared to the others, but at the same time, it is more densely populated and intensively cultivated. The arts and sciences flourish there, and the fighting spirit of its people has served as a constant source of illumination, such that it is more beautiful and secure than other renowned and famous provinces. And furthermore, it should be known that the greatest rulers of all ages have compared this land to the sun, and most of them have ruled from here. Okay, remember that. Europe is the sun in the constellation of continents. These have included the magnificent Sultan Alexander the Great, who ruled 918 years before the Prophet Muhammad Mustafa, and 284 years after him began the empire of the Romans, and today, in the year 967 of the Muslim calendar, Europe is ruled by His Majesty Suleiman of the House of Osman, Sultan of Sultans and refuge of the rulers of the world, who is an even greater source for the illumination of humanity. And alongside of him, the realms of the kings of France and Spain are also included in this continent, who are comparable to the planets Jupiter and Mercury. And it also sparkles with the light of the famous and prosperous realms of Italy and Portugal and Germany and Sarmatia, which are all described in more detail below. Okay. A couple of things to point out here. First, this is the only continent that receives this kind of a treatment. Much, much more extensive than any of the other continents, which basically just consist of a description of their geographical extensiveness and then a list of some of the important rulers. Europe is the only one that has some sort of a historical and cultural identity ascribed to it. But I hope you'll notice that a lot of the elements that we would expect to find here are absent. There is nothing here about Christianity at all. That's completely avoided. There's nothing here about Latin letters or humanism. Instead, the definition is strictly political, and it's based on two things. On the one hand, an inheritance of the Greco-Roman imperial legacy, Alexander the Great and Rome. And on the other hand, there's a sense of a political dynamism in the contemporary world. So these are the two things that you really need to be considered fully European. Now, if I had more time, I would actually be able to go through and read the descriptions of each of the individual European countries to show you the ways in which Haji Ahmet finesses the case and really takes this seriously. But I don't have enough time, so what I'll do is just cut to the chase and read you how he describes the Ottoman Empire. As I hope you noticed from that description that the Ottoman Empire was included as a European state according to the terms that Haji Ahmet has described to begin with. Okay, so he says, His illustrious Majesty, the refuge of magnificence, scion of the most noble house of Osman, has been compared to the sun. Okay, remember this, that Jupiter and Saturn are France and Spain and so forth. He first and foremost illuminates Europe, but the power from the rays of his magnificence are such that Asia and Africa are his moons, and other rulers cannot even be compared to the stars, either in terms of their brilliance or their greatness, for all are obscured and left in shadow before his radiance. This noble house, through its valor and bravery, is constantly victorious, ruling the provinces of Anatolia, Karaman, Diyarbakir, Erzurum, Baghdad, Damascus, Arabia, all of Egypt, the Balkans and Hungary, and many other lands. The borders of their dominions stretch from Germany in the north and extend to the opposite side to Arabia, and in Africa to the south as far as Ethiopia, and in the direction of the west as far as Morocco. In short, the glory and power and majesty of the House of Osman are immeasurable, and countless lords, both Muslim and Christian, have long paid tribute to it. And currently, from this illustrious house, the Sultan of Sultans, who are the proof of rulership, lord of the conjunction of the time of Alexander, His Majesty Suleiman the Magnificent, rules from the Orient to Arabia with his bravery and power and glory and wisdom and justice and compassion. The majesty and wonder of his rule are such that they cannot be described by the tongue nor recorded by the pen, although much has nevertheless been written in this regard. Okay, so in this passage you really see the crux of the whole schema, right? Just as Europe is the sun in the constellation of continents, the Ottoman Sultan is the sun in the constellation of world rulers. He's the embodiment of Europeanness, and in fact the ultimate proof of his Europeanness is the fact that he's conquered so many territories outside of Europe. And this again is something that gets elaborated in other points in the text when he's describing non-European nations. For instance, there's a very interesting passage about Peru where he says, the people of Peru used to be pagans and used to speak their own language, but then they were conquered by the Spanish, so now they are Christians and speak Spanish, just like the people of Anatolia used to have their own language and religion, but now speak Turkish and are Muslim. This is a fascinating inversion of the way that the Turkification and Islamification of Anatolia is typically imagined as being a previously existing European civilization that is then overwhelmed by an Oriental horde. Instead, what Haji Ahmed is saying is that the Ottomans have conquered Anatolia from Europe, and by making it Muslim and Turkish are actually making it more European. Okay, so this is really quite an original take on the whole thing. Now, I said that I wasn't going to get into the debate about who really Haji Ahmed is. I know you're frustrated by that, but I just don't have time, okay? But what I want to tell you is that, in a certain sense, no matter who he is, this kind of a vision of universal sovereignty and a specific kind of Ottoman universal sovereignty based on Europeanness and Romanness is something that would have resonated very strongly with a debate that was going on in the Ottoman Empire at exactly this time about what it means precisely to be an Ottoman, okay? And this is a debate that's going on in the context of the Ottoman Empire having stopped growing in the 1550s and 1560s after about a century of really frenetic growth. And as the empire stops growing, there's a realization that the expectation people might have had that the empire was going to continue to grow forever was not necessarily a realistic one. And all of a sudden, in the competition for imperial resources that are now understood as finite, this question of who has the most legitimate claim on those resources had become much more important. And so people are really trying to work through this debate about who's really an Ottoman. On the one side, there are people that are saying exactly what Haji Ahmed is saying, that the Ottomans are the reincarnation of the Roman Empire. They're trying to elaborate a language of Ottoman sovereignty that is very European. And it's not surprising that the people that were most enthusiastic about this kind of vision of Ottoman sovereignty are people who are recent immigrants from Western European countries, people who are first-generation converts to Islam. And you have to remember that there are a lot of people that are like this, even at the very highest levels of the Ottoman elite. And there's a sense, in fact, in which during this period, the Ottoman state actually is systematically favoring people who are first-generation converts or recent immigrants to the empire over old Muslim families. And this is kind of what's getting worked through here. So that's one vision of Ottoman sovereignty, but it's not the only one, because there's another contrasting vision of Ottoman sovereignty, which is much more articulated through the language of Islam. So to give you a kind of a contrasting example, this is kind of where I want to end up. There's this famous work by this guy, Saidi Ali Rais, who wrote a travel narrative to India and back, exactly contemporary, 1561, so this was made in 1559. He's from an old Muslim family. He's a commander in the Ottoman Navy. He's from the Black Sea. He has a very famous passage that everybody cites, including Sanjay. He doesn't cite anything that anybody else cites, so it tells you that it's important. And it's when he's in India and he's having a conversation with the Mughal emperor. And the Mughal emperor Humayun basically asks him, whose empire is bigger, mine or the Ottomans? And Saidi Ali says, verily, the 7 climes of the inhabited quarter of the world conquered by the great Alexander the Great are coterminous with the realms of the magnificent Padishah of Rum. But then he says, the real proof of this is that in each of these 7 climes, the Muslims read the khutbah, the Friday sermon, in the Ottoman Sultan's name. Okay, this is the way that you really can see the expression of Ottoman sovereignty. It's through Islam. All right, so even though he's using the same language of Alexander and Romanness, he's saying that it's really about Islam. Now, what I think is fascinating is that we have evidence from other writings of the same author that when he says this, he actually has this map, or something very much like this map, in mind as what he's arguing against. And here I would cite another of his works, something called the Kitab al-Muhit, written a couple of years later. It's a navigational guide. There's a chapter in there where he he's laying out the principles of cartography. And he says that there are 2 basic types of world maps. One is called harita, that's actually the modern Turkish word for a map. And the other is called mappamundi. And then he gives etymologies for these 2 types of maps. He says, harita is derived from the word quarta, which in Latin means quarter. And it is so called because it shows only the inhabited quarter of the world that was previously coterminous with the realms conquered by Alexander the Great. Okay? And as such, it also would be of the kind of Ptolemaic map that medieval Arab cartographers made. The other kind of map, mappamundi, comes from pappamundi. Papa being the Pope, or the greatest of the Christians, and mundi meaning the entire world. Okay, so what he's saying is that by making a map in this way, you are somehow buying into an explicitly Christian understanding of what the world looks like that then translates into an implicit acceptance of the kind of universal claims that the Pope was making. And as a result, this is actually incommensurate with Ottomanness. You can't make a map that looks like this because it is in conflict with the basic concept of Ottoman sultan's claim to being a universal ruler as a Muslim ruler. Okay, this is a Christian way of presenting the world. This is a fascinating example of the way that Sanjay was talking about this problem of how it's very difficult to know how people at the time interpreted these kinds of visual traditions. But in this case, it's made explicit. This map was read explicitly in an ideological way as being incommensurate with Ottomanness. All right? The last image that I want to show you, I can change it up here. All right. This is a map from an Ottoman history, Kuntul Akbar, quite famous, late 16th century. And this is really the kind of map that Sayyidi Ali Rais is advocating. I know it's quite abstract from our perspective, but basically you're looking, it's north at the bottom. This is the Balkans here, Constantinople is here. This is Africa. This is Asia. And these 7 lines are indicating the 7 climes. Okay, this is a Ptolemaic map, essentially. But there are 2 things that I really want to draw your attention to. One is this giant Ottoman pencil minaret. And the caption here reads, Jami-i Jihan Numa Budur, means this is the minaret from which the entire world can be surveyed. Okay, so here it's just telling you that this is what the world looks like from the top of the greatest minaret of all, which is an Ottoman-style minaret. Okay? And then down here, this says Vilayet Bosna, so this is the province of Bosnia. This would be the border between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. And what you'll see here is there's just blackness, all right? And there is, the caption here says Zulmat, the lands of darkness or the lands of oppression, all right? This kind of map, by the 17th century, becomes hegemonic in the Ottoman Empire. This is the way that Ottomans make maps. And the world has now been construed in an explicitly Islamic way that leaves no room even to represent Europe at all. Europe is not on this map, except as the lands of darkness. It's gone, okay? And this becomes hegemonic. What I think is fascinating is this becomes hegemonic in the same way that the concept of Europe in the West also becomes hegemonic by the 17th century in a way that leaves absolutely no space to include the Ottoman Empire. All right, so what you can see here is actually the civilizational boundary coming down. All right, so to sort of go back to the beginning where we left off, we started with these 2 contrasting interpretations of Haji Ahmed's map. The one presenting it as a kind of an icon of cosmopolitanism, the other one as really kind of an Orientalist, really precursor of Orientalism. I mean, that's what Minhaj is saying. It's kind of a precursor of the 19th century Orientalist fantasy a la Richard Burton of being able to learn to imitate the Orientals so convincingly that he can't even tell the difference between you and the real thing. Okay, so these are kind of the 2 opposing ideas about what this map really is. I would suggest that rather than cosmopolitanism or Orientalism, we really need to understand this map as a historical artifact from a fleeting moment in time in which it was possible to imagine both Europe and the Ottoman Empire according to terms that were radically different from anything that would have been possible before and anything that would be possible thereafter. So different, in fact, that by the time we get to the 20th century, the only way that scholars can even deal with Haji Ahmed is as an imposter and his text as a forgery. And I would just end by suggesting that since we're now in the 21st century, perhaps it's time from the special vantage point of our own historical moment that we take his words a little bit more seriously. So thank you very much.
So I had actually read quite different papers, and I summarized those and had some ideas to start a discussion. But I don't. I'm not going to do that for a number of reasons. Partly also just because of time, after the urgency of getting a drink, and also the fact that all of you will want to ask questions. But I just thought that it might be interesting in the context of what the talks were that I saw, to show you some of the images of a map that I've been working on by Melchior Lorck, a Danish artist who goes to Istanbul with Bosbek as a part of the embassy with the Holy Roman Empire. So these are the left-hand side. I'm just going to walk you through the image because I think that since it's a map, it's a kind of interesting counterpoint to both Giancarlo and to Natalie's papers. I know it's impossible to see because it's so small, but I'll show you a few details. But it'll at least give you a sense of moving from left to right. We're standing in Pera, looking across the Golden Horn toward Istanbul. So this is getting close to the center, and you can see the artist depicted on the right. I'm just going to go back to that one for a moment. One of the interesting things about the panorama is it's no longer extant. It's in fragments, as you can see. It was something that was probably intended for print, and that's something that I talk about at length elsewhere. But this is an interesting view because you can see that the view of Istanbul is located in the library in Leiden, and it was actually located there at the end of the 16th century. So there was this kind of opportunity for visitors in the library to be able to see the panorama to its full extent. So here's the center section of it, and I'll just say a couple of words about these two figures, because one of the things that that I've been interested in also with the new project that I'm working on is to try and think of different ways of accessing visual imagery in relation to European and Ottoman relations, in part by thinking about the spaces in between, by thinking about the kind of process of movement and how that's in some ways connected to images. So my project looks at inscription and the horizon as being different modes of being. One, the embodied experience of mark making, which for me is figured in the artist who is making the map with he's holding a dramatic pen, and the Ottoman man to our right is holding an inkwell. So the kind of inscriptive process of mark making, and then the horizon, which is connected to what's in the distance. And that's something that I'm looking at in terms of the fraught geopolitical context of the embassy. But one of the things that I want to suggest is that this idea of the near and the far are not mutually exclusive, and that they come up against each other. And I'm interested in thinking about the way of negotiating distance from, the ways that images became a way of negotiating either distance or proximity to the Ottomans. I think I have another detail of the artist here. So the dates, just to fill in a couple of the details. This is an immense panorama in terms of its length. It's about 11.5 meters wide, and it's about this tall. It was probably finished in Vienna after he left Istanbul in 1559, and that's the date that's written in the block that you see to the right-hand side. But he was in Istanbul for 3 years with Bosbek, and in fact, for most of that time, they were confined to the embassy building, which is it's kind of interesting because there's a detail. I don't think I'll have time to show you that, but there's a detail of. I'll just go back. There's a detail of where they were incarcerated, which is just to the left of what we can see here. And it actually says in the inscription that's on the map, there's inscriptions in Italian and in German, it points out that this was the place that the embassy was incarcerated for 3 years. So there's this interesting way that he's actually standing on the Latin side in Pera, looking across to Istanbul and kind of seeing the place where he'd actually been imprisoned while he's in Istanbul. So I would say that for me this seems kind of radically different from Natalie's transimperial subject in the sense that this is somehow much more about the kind of confrontation and difficulty that was faced during the trip. So I really just introduced these for other images that in some ways are connected to some of the issues that you raised, but I really just wanted to open it up for questions or comments on the papers. Yeah.
Well, all of these papers are things that would be worth asking about, but was only allowed to ask one question. So I'm going to address this one to Natalie. I wonder, especially since we've been hearing now about maps and so on in printed form, this codex that you talked about, this is not a printed codex, this is a single copy codex.
Right.
And you described it as something that should help inform members of the Venetian Senate, I guess, about what would await them if they went to Istanbul or the Ottoman Empire. What do we know, or what would you guess about who really got this codex? Who had it? Who got to see it? We're talking about just one copy of something. It doesn't get widely circulated. What person or people, or type of person or type of people would actually see this book before it just sort of ended up in a library or it's sitting for hundreds of years?
Yeah, I should have clarified that the argument I'm making is not about this particular object as informing a broader worldview, but rather this particular artifact as exemplary of a much broader process of mediation. This particular codex, as you point out, was in manuscript form. We don't know anything about its circulation, and in fact, we don't know even the history of patronage and ownership up until the mid-19th century when it was purchased by Emanuele Cicogna, the great Venetian collector and historian. The point I would like to make, though, is that this artifact already embodies a certain perspective which we can see more broadly in Venetian textual and visual production about the Ottoman Empire. And the reason it embodies the same kind of perspective is because of the heavy involvement of dragomans in mediating this relationship between Venetians and Ottomans, a mediation that is articulated and made explicit in this object, but that it permeates all kinds of Venetian writings about the Ottomans, and particularly the dispacci and the relazioni, the two genres of writing, ethnographic writing, diplomatic writing about the Ottomans, which circulate very widely and get translated into all kinds of languages and appear in print form very quickly after they arrive in Venice, supposedly as secretive missives for the Senate, but in fact we know had a much broader audience and had an immense impact. In fact, so much so that von Ranke in the 19th century, when he was writing this history, relied on these dispatches and reports as if they were somehow kind of an objective narrative of Ottoman history rather than a heavily mediated text that already embodies a particular perspective.
If I could just say sort of a couple of things, I speak to all the papers which were just read. And my starting point is really, I think, what I very much agree with about a defective historical anthropology that seems to lead to a kind of either-or situation of either too cultural or it's a question of, kind of empirical verification. I think what's happening in anthropology is a very firm move away from those questions of identity to an attempt precisely to focus on experience. And I think once you start doing that, this leads you to what I wanted to really say towards your piece. And an observation in general that even as we grapple with all this, we we're transness, we're mediating that, we're finding ways between. This strikes me very much as therefore a kind of common conceptual problem we have in talking about those processes that we see are important. And my suggestion is the language of identity can never get there, and that the language of ontology is the only kind of way forward, right? And looking at your trans-imperial subjects, although this is, an awful lot to begin sort of including for everyone's work, in anthropology, I think by thinking about those trans-imperial subjects not just as humans, but as animals, microbes, quasi-objects, things which cannot easily be assigned to subject or object positions. I mean, is a slave's body an object or is it a subject? And so our language that gets so complicated over questions of identity, it may not be that we can solve the issue through them, but by pluralizing ontology, pluralizing states of being, then those questions of identity begin to look very different. Which leads me very much to what you've shown us. I mean, one wants to say, okay, so that the Cold War curtain is coming down, but of course that's the match. If maps of power, these are the outcomes of the crystallization of certain power blocks. And we know already that individuals trapped within that are finding unlivable positions because of the need to respond to identity claims or identity issues that are foisted on them, if not purely from an internal avocation, certainly from the changing political reality of Europe and elsewhere. And if I could just throw Starden in here, his conundrum is precisely assuming that Christendom is a reality, to encounter that his Germanness is the reason the French traders turn around to the Tupi and say, eat him, he's your enemy and mine. And those new politics of identity then are very problematic for ontology. That's a comment. I hope you got some thoughts back rather than a question.
Do you want to respond or just take another question?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that's very helpful, and one of the things that fascinates me about this particular topic is that it's so clear to me. I mean, I was only able to share a little bit of the material, but it's very clear when you're reading it, on the one hand, how hard Haji Ahmed is trying to make his case, and on the other hand, the ways in which he's already undermined his own argument from the beginning. For example, by assuming this persona of a Muslim to give his, whatever he's saying, more of a truth value, which is in fact acknowledging that if he's not a Muslim, then it's not true, but he's actually trying to say it doesn't matter that he's a Muslim. And the first sentence that I even read is, Europe, this is the place that they also call Frangistan. That tells us first that people wouldn't know the word Europe, but second, the only word that he can think of to explain it is a word that it in fact has within it this sense of foreignness that is again undermining his position. So I think that's really gets to what you're saying.
Giancarlo, I'm persuaded by one part of your argument, but I'm not persuaded by the second part. I'm persuaded that there were these different visions at play, the mamas versus the papas, or whatever it was. But I'm not persuaded that the curtain came down, because after all, what do you do with Khatib Chalabi, who comes after this? After all, that is a vision of the world which is not this Daryai Muhit version which you're getting in the Kun al-Akhbar. It's now, of course,
that's much later, though.
Yeah, but it means that there's some kind of a tradition which is there, where this guy is still collecting stuff. He's still reading Paolo Giovio. He's reading Jesuit letters on Japan. He produces a map of Japan with each province clearly marked, with each daimyo's domain clearly marked, and so on and so forth. So, then the next question is, if the curtain came down, would it just come down and come up again?
Yeah, of course, this isn't the end of the story, right? But what happens then is that by the time you get to Khatib Chalabi, which is, after all, more than 100 years after Haji Ahmed, this is actually the problem that he is addressing explicitly. He's saying, listen, guys, this is the hole that we've got ourselves in now. We've developed an idea of what it means to be Ottoman that makes it incapable for us to even engage with these different kinds of intellectual questions, and this is something that we have to find a way out of. And he's very open about saying that that's exactly his project. And all those sources that he's compiling and translating and introducing is precisely because he's trying to redirect the kind of intellectual discourse. That's the way I see it anyway.
There was another question first, and then hand up over there.
Yeah, so forgive me, I'm just a beginning PhD student, so I'm going to try to articulate this question, and any three of you can answer it. So, Hussein, it seems to me that part of what you're arguing is sort of a third being, a third way of looking at it. So if you're arguing for more of a rejection of this sort of binary essentialist arguments, it seems to me that you're also sort of combining a cultural analysis with an existential analysis, and I think it's really interesting. You and I were talking yesterday, sort of along these lines, and it seems sort of almost a middle ground, or another way of looking at a type of middle ground. And then, Natalie, it seems that as well, I mean, how would you relate your argument to the middle ground? If you know what I mean by that, what's the middle ground? Because it seems to me that your intermediaries are sort of players in that middle ground. And you're sort of adding a different angle to that. Rather than looking at the middle ground, the intermediary as a player within the sort of that analysis. And then I was just, my mind was totally boggled, Giancarlo, because it seemed in the beginning you were talking about how the Ottoman Empire was sort of a creative mechanism for Europe. And then at the end of your presentation, was a rejection of Europe from this Ottoman perspective. And so in a way that's also kind of this contradiction, but not a contradiction, is the way you're arguing. It's sort of like both exist. So I have this sort of image of a third being in this sort of, because it seems that all of you are addressing hybridity and breaking down essentialism. So if you could address something towards that. Now I know that doesn't sound like a question, but maybe it does. I don't know.
Can I answer? Actually, I see my work as a sort of critique, not so much of Richard White's work, which is phenomenal, but of more of the caricature responses to and adaptations of the middle ground concept that I think have turned it into a really kind of spatial metaphor of two separate units coming into contact. And I think White's work is actually far more sophisticated than that. My point is that there is no middle ground a priori. That is, it's really problematic, particularly in the Mediterranean context, but I think in other contexts as well, to assume that what we have are two units that are previously separate and only come into contact through particular acts of mediation. Rather, I think that these are ongoing types of interactions, as we heard today, even thinking about what is really Mughal and really European as types of artistic production styles, tropes, etc., is incredibly problematic and not particularly fruitful analytically, let alone in the context of Venetians and Ottomans, who even drawing the boundary politically is incredibly difficult and constantly shifting in this period. So rather, I think that if we are to talk about middle ground, it's more productive to think of it as a kind of politically charged act of arguing where the boundary lies, and it's an act that is always open to struggles and contestations, rather than as a place where previously unconnected units come into contact. So hybridity is actually a really problematic term in this context, precisely because it adopts a kind of biological image of separate species coming into intermingling, rather than things that are always already in interaction with one another.
I think both the earlier philosophical tradition that was wedded to economic rationalism, debates about tolerance and intolerance from the 17th and 18th century, and the sort of hermeneutic culturalist version that we've taken on, which is far more relativistic, both actually presume a middle ground, right? Interaction only happens in certain spaces or in certain terms. And therefore we have terms like hybrids. We're all interested in similar characters, but actually what I heard, which I was very pleased to hear in all these because it makes me feel like I actually have some good ideas, is the characters turn out to always be inside outsiders, right? Internal outsiders. So exception is the term I introduced as the productive one. It's not a space so much as almost like a thrown-inness to the world, like Kierkegaard. I'm not interested in staging a space where interaction happens and then leaving other things outside, but rather examining what are the consequences of the very intimate presence of a Muslim, say, or the figure of a Muslim in kinds of political theological claims I'm talking about in particular of Christian sovereigns, or the other way around, of Muslim sultans.
This is the last question.
Yeah, right. As I was reading your pre-circulated piece, Natalie, and then listening again to the presentation about trans-imperial subjects, I was thinking a lot in terms of the 20th century and how folks who can use that problem of borders and alterity pose a variety of questions. And then I started thinking about my own stuff on South Florida, and I was going to reference your work directly for tomorrow's presentation when we go back to the 20th century. Then I started thinking about some phrases that you use, which is where alterity is produced and managed, which I love, and also subjects who are caught in the web of competing imperial mechanisms. And so I'd like to actually ask your panel mates whether or not Guzman can be defined as a trans-imperial subject, or your map maker, is he caught in a web of competing imperial mechanisms in a strange way? And more pointedly, who isn't a trans-imperial subject? I mean, because the difficulty of definitions is always when we have to basically draw a boundary, unless we want to cross them. You don't want a character who is everywhere and does nowhere in particular. So is there a way that even in your own term, Natalie, you can add specificity? I mean, I think your article is really great about using the documents to kind of provide your boundaries, right? In terms of certain translations are effective, certain translations are less so, but is that the only way in which we can locate those boundaries around specific documents, or is there an actual boundary to the definition itself that might be useful so that we don't get caught in kind of throwing everything within that box?
Well, the question of who isn't a trans-imperial subject, I mean, I guess it's not a state of being so much as a kind of, depending on circumstances, you can become or not become one. And I think that the interesting thing about this particular case is that, you know, if you look at Haji Ahmed's arch rivals, Sayyidi Ali Rais, in this particular context, Sayyidi Ali Rais is not a trans-imperial subject, because what he's trying to say is, I know what I am, I'm an Ottoman, and I'm going to draw some lines to make sure that it's very clear who isn't an Ottoman. Whereas Haji Ahmed, you know, Minaj's idea about who he is that he's this guy, Michele Membre, who is this one of the dragomans that Natalie is talking about. He, at that time, as somebody who's just gotten this peach of a job in Venice, but he was originally born in Cyprus. He had lived most of his youth in Istanbul, and then, you know, had gotten Venetian citizenship and gotten to Istanbul. So he was still very in touch with these milieux, I love this word, in the East. But by the end of his life, he's actually a very established person in Venice who is arguing for all of these new regimes designed to regulate people being able to move to and from the Ottoman Empire, controlling people who are not Christians and their movements in Venice. So by that point, he's no longer a trans-imperial subject. He's just kind of sold his soul to the other side. So it's what's fascinating is the way that you can kind of move in and out of this space. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm particularly interested, I think we all are, in extreme subjects, or at least mine are extreme subjects. So the way in which Guzman el Bueno, but also Muslim soldiers surrounding the body of a Christian sovereign come to come symbolize both extreme prestige but also a kind of slavery at the same time, is what fascinates me. And that's what makes them imperial subjects. But the wonderful thing about the Middle Ages is sovereignty is not, sovereignty is an early modern fiction, right? And it's only starting to be worked out. Roman law has a huge impression on the Crown of Aragon at this period. So they're, for the first time, making jurisdictional claims that no one has ever heard of in the Crown of Aragon. And when Muslim soldiers appear putting down rebellion, subjects are terribly confused about what kinds of gestures the Aragonese kings are making. But life happens outside of empire and sovereignty all over my period. There are plenty of other zones that are occluded by insisting on empire, at least in the late medieval period.
Great, so please join me in thanking the speakers.